Welcome to Specific Lab. Today I'm going to show you how we took a sheet of plywood and turned it into an amazing lighthouse. Let's begin. To begin this project, I needed to cut down a sheet of 3/4 inch plywood. So I picked up a sheet of 1 inch foam insulation to lay on the floor. This insulation is sturdy enough to suspend the wood and act as a sacrificial layer for my circular saw. I then adjusted my saw to 22.5 degrees and found a width of the blade at the base. I next measured the location on the plywood and clamped down a long straight board to act as a guide. And with a slow steady motion, I made a first cut, making sure the angle of the blade was facing inward. I next readjusted the guide, changed my direction of attack, and sliced out the first main board. I then flipped the plywood over to maintain the correct angle from the last cut. I next used the newest board to measure out and mark the location of the next piece, clamped the guide in place, and cut the second board. I repeated this process several times until I had 8 similar pieces and a little bit left over. I then tried to see if I could glue the first scrap of cut wood back to the remaining. It was a little challenging, but I had plenty of clamps and it went together quite nicely. Once the glue had dried, I found the width of the board and cut out a square on my miter saw. I then tried to make this piece into an octagon, but that turned out to be harder than I imagined. So I finally asked for my son's protractor, which made this process much easier. I then used my jigsaw to trim out the shape. I was impressed with the end result and decided to make a second larger piece just in case I needed it later. This time I cut out 2 longer rectangles from the remaining board and glued them together. It was now time to build the main structure, so I laid out some plastic to protect the floor and the wood. My first attempt was to roll out some tape in a few areas, place the wood side by side, and add a bunch of glue along each seam, and carefully try to roll up the wood using the first octagon as a guide. At first, everything was rolling up well, and I was excited. Okay, the glue alone, well, that did not work out. As you see, everything's back flat again, because everything fell apart right after I turned off the camera. So, I'm gonna try and see if I can screw this together using some octagons. So, let's try that. The first octagon I made was a good fit about 1/3 of the way down from the top. So I added a screw from the outside. I then flipped the board over and added a second board to the opposite side using some wood for spacing at the bottom. I continued to add pieces around the first, but after adding about half the boards I realized I needed the second octagon. So I again used my son's protractor to sketch out a shape on some paper, glue it to the wood, and cut it out. Amazingly, the second octagon fit about 1/3 of the way up from the bottom. I then attached the current boards to the shape and continued adding the rest of the pieces. Now, even though the center of the column was straight, the ends were still a little out of alignment. So I grabbed my strap clamp and some tape. I started at the top and worked my way down by clamping all of the boards straight and then wrapping several layers of tape in many locations. This may not be the ideal way to hold this structure together, but it worked for me this time. Alright, now this was definitely a little more challenging than I thought it was going to be. Fortunately, I had this strap that helped me pull everything together and I was able to put a bunch of tape around it. And hopefully the glue is still wet enough to dry. If not, well, I'll just add some more wood. But overall, I'm glad I'm done with this step. I also went back and added some extra glue to the ends for extra strength. After giving it a couple of days to dry, I removed the tape and it held. But I could not leave it alone, so I pried apart the loosest board and added a bunch more glue to the inside of every board. This may not have been needed, but it is surely secure now. I then glued the board back in place, replaced the screws, and taped it together. After a couple of days, my son helped me carry it outside for sanding. In the process, I realized the wood was getting scarred from the concrete and placed some old pizza boxes underneath to protect it. I also noticed some of the screws were not fully seated, so I used my countersink to lower them. The column required a bunch of sanding to remove all of the excess glue. In fact, I had to use my knife to remove some of the larger pieces. And then I sanded some more. In the process of doing all this sanding, I finally burnt up my cordless sander. So it's always good to have a backup on hand that is corded, just for these occasions. My son then helped me move it back into my shop for painting, and it barely fit between the ceiling joists. But before I started, I had to wipe down the entire structure to remove as much dust as possible. I first started with a primer and sealer to help protect the wood and keep anything from bleeding into the paint. And while that was drying, I focused on the top. I chose to use a solar light so the entire structure could be placed anywhere and did not need electricity. This light somewhat reflected the structure that might be seen on top of a real lighthouse, but it needed a good base to sit in. So I started by making a circle to fit on the top of the column. It was sized to be slightly wider than the column so it would stand out a little. I then cut out 4 more circles with a smaller diameter. I next glued and clamped the 4 smaller pieces together. After giving it a day to dry, I took the circles to the belt sander to smooth down all of the misalignments. I then used 120 grit on my orbital sander to remove any rough edges. Returning to the light, I used a caliper to find the size of the shaft and drilled a hole in the circle with a Forstner bit. This was a 2-step process because my drill press was a little short on the first pass, so I shimmed the wood and completed the cut. I then took apart the light to find the best way to seal it from water. I decided to go with some clear silicone under the glass insert, and just put everything back together, wiping away any excess that squeezed out. I then decided I wanted to slightly enlarge the top of the circle to give a wider support to the light. This was a quick fix and the light fit great. To hold the circle to the smaller, I just added some screws from the bottom. I then gave it a coating in primer and placed it to the side to dry. Now for the top of the light, I wanted to add a small overhang. So I cut out an additional circle and used a caliper and protractor to measure out an internal circle. I then drilled a pilot hole and cut it with a jigsaw. And to give it a sloping edge, I used the oscillating sander. The finished edge may not be perfect, but it will be 9 feet in the air, so no one will see it. I then coated it in primer. I next went back to the column and added a white exterior paint to protect it from the elements. I then went back to the overhang and was not happy with the edge, so I fixed it with my router. Once the column had dried, I attempted to add stripes and failed. Then my wife joined in and we still had problems finding the best angle for the stripes to look even. Okay, this has turned out to be a lot bigger ordeal than I thought. And I guess we're just doing the Edison idea, which is just try again. Hopefully we don't have to do this 10,000 tries to get this. And I believe we're gonna try it some more with this paper, which I hope this is gonna work. Otherwise, we'll try something else. Let's see if it works. And finally, after several attempts, the stripes aligned and we taped it in place. We then lightly traced the paper with a pencil to show us where to place the tape. We then finally removed the paper and prepared the column for painting. And as the black was applied, it was a relief to be past this step. While the column dried, I taped off the light, roughed up the paint with steel wool, and gave it a coating of red. I also sprayed the circles and overhang in red too. Getting this part where we finally had the lines at least somewhat even in this lighthouse took so long, and I'm just so excited that we finally have it painted and we're about to take the tape off. On the bottom of the circles, I decided to paint it black because this should hide any future water stains. My wife then removed the tape from the light and I did a test fit that looked awesome. But we felt like it was missing something. So my wife cut a bunch of bamboo chopsticks, painted them red, drilled some holes, and I tapped each of them into the large circle. She then added a couple rows of wire, thus created an awesome looking gate around the light. To hold the overhang in place, I used some silicone, but I left 4 open spots so water could drain and not sit stagnant on the top. I then gave the light a quick test and it worked great with only my hand blocking the sensor. Now I'm assembling this lighthouse for a longtime friend. Unfortunately, it's about a 3 to 4 hour drive to go from our house to their house, so I can't attach the top to the main column as of yet. To do that though, it's very simple. I'm just going to drill a couple holes on each side, put a couple screws in, dab a little bit of paint and maybe some silicone around the edges just to make sure water doesn't get in. Otherwise, it's a very simple attachment to the top. Now I'm going to take this outside, put this on the top for you so you can enjoy what it looks like. Now I hope you enjoyed the build process of this lighthouse. It was definitely a difficult build, but we enjoyed the end result. It looks amazing. Now if you enjoyed this project, make sure you click the like button. Tell us what you think about it in the comments, and as always, have fun building.
How did I end up with 3? You have 1.
Because you're better than I at pulling tape.
At pulling tape, but not building lighthouses. She can pull tape. Hers really good. Her is helpful.